Welcome to the first series of sex and gender bias in artificial intelligence and health. This is the first seminar of this cycle, organized by the Bioinfo for Women program of the Barcelona Supercomputing Center and La Caixa Foundation here at PalauMacaya in Barcelona. My name is Davide Cirillo. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Life Sciences Department of the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, and today I will be the host and the moderator of this session. After the opening conference last month, we are back today with an outstanding group of panelists and our audience, both present and virtual. The focus of today's seminar is the sex and gender perspective in the future of personalized medicine. We will talk about the necessity and the challenges to include sex and gender differences in biomedical research and clinical practice in order to achieve better prevention and diagnosis and improve treatment decisions. We will also touch upon the role of artificial intelligence in this context and the biases that are associated with those systems. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. So we have here Dr. Carme Valls. She's a physician specialized in endocrinology with a gender perspective, and she is the director of the Women, Health and Quality of Life initiative at the Center for Health Analysis and Programs, CAPS. Online, we have Dr. Valeria Raparelli. She's assistant professor of internal medicine at the University of Ferrara in Italy and adjunct assistant professor in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta, Canada. She's co-leader of the project Going Forward for Gender in Health at McGill University in Montreal and principal investigator of the Endocrine Vascular Disease Approach project. Then online we have Dr. Luis Rocha, professor of informatics at Indiana University in Bloomington, where he's director of the interdisciplinary training program in complex networks and systems and director of the Center for Social and Biomedical Complexity. He's also principal investigator at the Institute Gulbenkian in Portugal. And online as well, Dr. Silvina Catuara Solarz. She's a project evaluator and mentor of startups at EIT Health, member of the WHO Digital Health Roster of Experts, lead in technology application for neuroscience and mental health, and member of the Women's Brain Project. I would like to thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to our panel discussion, which will take place after the presentations from each one of you. And after the panel discussion, so at the end, we will read the questions from the audience, and I invite the audience actually to write the question in the chat that you can find in the streaming service. So let's start with the presentation. Let's follow the same order. So Carmen, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Bueno, en primer lugar, vamos a hablar de la perspectiva.
Firstly, we're going to talk about the sex and gender perspective in the future of medicine. And the first problem that we found 30 years ago, and which is ongoing, is the fact that the majority of the scientific papers do not include the factors of sex and gender. And when we were talking about health, we saw that health goes beyond biology, but at the same time, it is biology, genetics, endocrinology, but immersed in a culture with different working conditions for men and women, with some mildering factors that do not render the overload any milder, especially in the case of women, and with an environment that is conditioning the mental and physical health of the human beings. The gender differentiated research is very scarce, and it is a mistake to mistake sex and gender. Sex is the biological and physiological characteristics, but the disaggregated statistics by sex are not updated in many of the papers, and the lack of differentiation assumes that by studying men, you're also studying women. The research with a gender perspective tries to analyze the health data in relation to the social, psychological, economical, political, ethical, cultural, environmental, and biological factors. It's not just the study of women, it's the study of the norms, beliefs, rights, obligations, and relationships that place women and men on a different foothold. Sex as a variable in medical research has been postulated in the recent 10 years, and there are some papers that consider characteristics that have to do with gender, from Clara Tannenbaum in Canada, for example. And there are studies and experiments that also consider that the sex of the researcher can have an impact on the result of the research. The gender biases in medicine, I'm trying to synthesize them in a book called Invisible Women for Medicine, and we have the stereotypes of gender, the lack of women in the researched cohort, the lack of female rats, and the lack of differential physiopathology, and the lack of valuation of different working life and psychosocial overload. And I'm going to have brief miscellaneous of cases of gender bias. We have the preclinic pharmacological research, differential mortality and morbidity, differential pharmacokinetics, and environmental differentiating factors. The first bias by gender in research, to use only male mice. In blue, you can see that 70% of the papers, the preclinic studies in cardiovascular, the first cause of mortality for women, it's just comprising male mice. And in red, you can see the female mice, and the clinical trials with mixed mice is represented in yellow. In gray, you can see the mice where the gender is unidentified, so we cannot analyze it. And there's more gender-based stereotypes influencing the design, and there is a study by Rebecca Shansky, which is really interesting and reflects upon the fact that as it is believed that men are the patterns because they have really good mental health, this stereotype is still influencing the way in which researchers conduct their research. The cohorts needs to be mixed or differentiated. Well, in neuroscience, it's really important to know this. And by analyzing 300 papers on neuroscience devoted to research, we could see that the reason why male mice were not included in the research papers was why female mice were not included was that they thought that the female mice had a lot of variability in the hormones, but it seems like male mice have more variability in hormones. Why? Because when male mice are gathered together, generate some hierarchical relationships, and as a result of that, the testosterone levels outstrips 5 times more the dominated mice level. So when they conduct an analysis, the clinical result, also have a high rate of variability. So we need to reflect before we conduct studies and before including mice from one gender or the other, or from both sexes, depending on the quality of paper you want to produce. And another important bias is how you leave the medicine faculty with the idea of how to prevent illnesses. Medicine has the purpose of expanding the quality of life. So when I ask professionals which is the first cause of death for women, they almost always get it wrong. In men, the main cause of death is cancer in the different manifestations, and then there's miscellaneous. The first cause of death for women is the ischemic cardiopathy, or brain stroke, cardiovascular causes on a world scale. This is from the WHO, and even though this dates back to 2009, if you click onto the WHO website, there is no clear, the slide is not as clear as that one, but it also states that it still continues to be the same cause. And they do not assess that the pathology of cardiopathy is the first cause for women, because there is a false belief that women are naturally protected from heart infarction by their natural characteristics. And all the research papers from the 80s until the 90s failed to include any women in the research studies. 22,000 male for coronary illnesses, etc. And this is a problem that we're going to find for the artificial intelligence papers, that the risk factors are analyzed in a male scale, and we do not know whether there are different risk factors for women. For years, I have tried to gather all the causes of cardiovascular risk factors. Let me point out that there are some which are more female preponderant, like hormone therapies, which are applied to women. And in hypothyroidism, it is really interesting to follow the population studies in the Rotterdam study. And it was proved that for myocardial infarction, hypothyroidism is more of a risk factor than smoking or diabetes, for example. And it was proved that by treating hypothyroidism, the endothelial cells improve, which is the cause for cardiovascular problems. And little by little, and this is a study of Anne M. Gillis, she's working on the differences in the electrocardiogram between between women and men. And this is not known. You do not leave the medicine faculty knowing this, and this is not taken into consideration in the ER. And it's really important in the treatment because the QT space of the electrocardiogram is longer in female, and there is a higher post-infarction death rate in women. And taking into consideration the sex in breathing illnesses, we can see that the hepatical treatment of hydrocarbon elements is higher in women. Smoking women have higher levels of adduction. So in equal exposure situations, it's possible that the lung cancer is going to be the one that is going to increase the most. And it's also interesting to follow the Rotterdam study. We have seen some predisposing factors for Alzheimer regarding anemia and hemoglobin, and the iron alterations are more preponderant in women, and this was never related. If you had ferropenia, this is something that predisposes you. So in mortality, we have a lot of lack of data, and in morbidity even more, because we have differences, biological, social, psychological differences that deserve special attention to women. And there are morbidities due to different biologies, due to the menstrual cycle, amenorrhea, oligomenorrhea, and metrorrhagia, deficit of the luteinic phase, premenstrual syndrome, etc. And then invisible morbidity because of anemia, ferropenia, osteopenia, and genetically there is a trend there in women, and this conditions more problems in thyroid problems because the main cause is the autoimmune thyroid syndrome. And this is something that we're still witnessing right now, because out of 2,484 studies registered in the clinical trials until May last year, barely 4% of the papers alluded to the differentiation of sex and gender. And out of the 11 clinical trials, there was no segregation for gender. 30 years ago, there was none, and it continues to be the case. And in morbidity above 50 years, we have hypertension, diabetes, thyroid pathology, breast cancer, obesity, and cardiovascular pathologies. And then another nuance is the delay of sex-based diagnosis. There is a delay of 700 illnesses of women versus male. And the diagnosis of cancer in women takes 2.5 years longer, and for diabetes 4.5 years later, as opposed to men. And the sex differences in genome and epigenome is being studied currently. This author is really good in order to follow the gender-based differences. And then we fail to diagnose well. We do not have clear risk factors, and then we provide with medication, but the bodies of women metabolize drugs in a different manner, and they have a higher risk of overdose and more secondary effects. The liver of women and men process hormones at a different rate, and out of 86 drugs researched, 76% higher concentration in the body of women. This is not just explained because of the difference in size, and this is a paper from last year. Body composition. Women have a slower metabolism in drugs, a higher accumulation of lipophilic drugs, bioaccumulation of insecticides and solvents, different concentrations of hydrophilic drugs depending on the water and the menstrual cycle, because there is water retention during the cycle, and changes in metabolism. And in men, the metabolism rate is higher, lower accumulation of lipophilic and solvents, etc. And in the hepatical metabolism, that's where we find the largest differences. The processing of hormones is different. Any hormone is going to become an estrogen in women, and estrogen and progesterone are metabolized through ZIP3A4, and in men the expressions of enzymes are different, with ZIP2D6 and ZIP2E1, and this is not taken into consideration in research nor treatment. And pharmacokinetics has not been studied, and sometimes it has been studied, but it's not well known by the professionals. I don't want to discourage the audience, but it's like that. And specific treatments for the gender, for the female gender, are done without the backing of the studies. For example, the non-study differential pharmacokinetics, the acetyl salicylic acid, aspirin, has not been tested, and it can generate a hemorrhage in the intestines. And the antiarrhythmic drugs generate more mortality in women because there is a different potassium pump in the cardiac cells in women, and antilipidemic drugs, and they're prone to producing statins, and more so if they have even subclinical hypothyroidism. And regarding specific therapies, the hormone treatments were used by trial and error in women because they had just been studied in 100 women when they were put in the market, the contraceptives, and also the replacement hormonal therapy in the menopause was untested, and there was an increase in cardiovascular risks and breast cancer. And the human papillomavirus vaccine was applied to 10-year-olds when it was studied with women above 24. So we need to change the way in which we research the age, the gender. It's really important in the analysis in the animals, in the drug trials, and how they are sold. And there's only differential toxical effects. The female body is a first chemical bioaccumulator of pesticide solvents and plastic derivatives, and the effect of alcohol is double, and smoking generates osteoporosis, and anorexia or bulimic disorders is more introduced in female bodies. And let me explain that this is from my environment and health book, New Risks for Women and Men, and we have this avalanche of environmental endocrine disruptors derived from plastic, flame retardants, hydrocarbon from the cars, etc., which have a different impact on women and men. And in women, all of these products are going to increase the level of estrogen in blood, and it's going to generate alterations in the menstrual cycle, but also more alterations in the breast, pre-menopause, and also menstruation alterations. So early menarche, early menopause, metrorrhage, and alterations of the menstrual cycle, and sterility in men and women, and atrophy of the testicles, and endometriosis, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and breast cancer, diabetes, also related to the environment, and obesity. It's not just eating a lot, but eating a lot with insecticides. This is going to generate the cycle. And in kids, this is also altering the fetus. Also, at the moment of embryogenesis, the exposure of the parents to insecticide has increased the abortions, and the fact that children, the girls can develop alterations in the ovaries, and also the boys can also have problems in the testicles, as well as mother alterations. And sometimes, instead of treating and diagnosing well, you introduce a treatment, and the most heavily drugged one is the women's body. And this medicalization is added to the mental health, because in Spain there is the highest consumption of drugs, and the highest consumption is coming from women. They are more prone to consuming more antidepressants in women. And this is a study that has been conducted in all the autonomous regions, and the national average reaches 20% that is consuming anxiolytic and these kinds of drugs. And something we didn't know is that these psychopharmacological treatments act differently in women and men, and women should have the dosage in order to achieve the results because of a different liver processing mechanism. So we are lacking this differentiation. This is being built. Londa Chebingen, who is going to come on the last day. I have been following her for a long time in order to be able to understand many differences. This is a science that we need to build, and for more than 20 years we wrote a book on how to adapt the curricula to the health problems, and we should start by working cardiopathy and endocrinology, and not just gynecology. Women are not just walking uterus, it's more than that, and it requires a specific study. And Nielsen and Schebinger in 2018 also suggested that the innovation of gender and sex should work in the diversity of the research teams. The more diversity, the better. Diversity in the methods of research, and diversity in the problems to be researched, because otherwise, if we follow the pharmaceutical industry, we would be stuck to researching cholesterol. I leave you here my magazine. As society did not pay heed to us, we generated this magazine with these different issues, and thank you very much.
For this really deep dive into the importance and implications of sex differences, from clinical studies to drug design, even to the environmental effect. I mean, it's really interesting. Okay, so Valeria, you are the next one.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you so much to the Bioinfo for Women program at the BSc and to the Caixa Foundation for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and discuss with all of you how sex and gender really are gateways for the future of precision medicine. Just a bit of background about me. I was trained in Rome and I got my first position as assistant professor over there. Then I did my PhD in Berlin at the Institute of Gender Medicine under the supervision of Professor Rigitz Zagrosek. Then I moved in 2017 in Montreal, Canada, where really I wanted to go because I want to acquire skills in terms of gender-based analysis. And now, since 2021, I'm here in this jewelry of the north of Italy, which is called Ferrara. And I have to say that the diversity of the working environment, I was really increased my capability of applied sex and gender-based analysis in my clinical studies. So this is the outline of my presentation. First of all, to me, precision medicine is really a sex and gender-informed medicine type. And I want to say that and share with you what I have learned so far in terms of integration of sex and gender in my clinical study. And please watch out throughout my presentation all the warning signs that to me are the most relevant take-home message of this presentation. And I will provide you really some practical example of how I dealt with sex and gender in non-communicable chronic disease, specifically cardiovascular disease. And in the last year, how I try to apply this lens also for the understanding of the COVID pandemic using the going forward approach that I will explain you later. So I'm a clinical scientist, but I'm also a practicing clinician. And really, I have witnessed to the 21st century paradigm shift of medicine. So my present is to base my clinical decision on the findings of randomized controlled trial, but I'm starting to appreciate the powerful tools and the algorithm that are the basis of the precision medicine approach. Actually, precision medicine to me is an extension of my existing medical care. It's a model for healthcare delivery that relies on big data and new technology and analytic tools. So we are in the middle of the so-called multi-omics revolution. So today we are really have the opportunity to capture the whole picture of biological system in hypothesis-free and unbiased models. And to me, the most important, the ultimate goal is always to improve patient outcome. So if we compare precision medicine approach to the traditional ones, we really want to now value the individual variability in terms of genes, environmental, lifestyle for each person, because we want to better stratify the risk of individuals and then provide them tailored intervention to get a common benefit across all the subgroups. So really the goal of precision medicine is equity in health, because we want to really provide each individual what fits his needs to achieve health. But also, I think that precision medicine cannot be only genetics and omics, because if we really want to characterize and individualize treatment and diagnostic tool, we really need to ask ourselves who are our patients. And there are two features, as already Dr. Valls mentioned, that really better define who we are, which are sex, When we use the term sex, we refer to all the biological attributes of people, including physical feature, chromosome, gene expression, hormones, anatomy. But maybe more overlooked, we are also gendered people, meaning that there are some social constructed role, behavior, expression, and identities that we should take into account when it comes to health. And so the most important message here is that sex and gender are not interchangeable terms, and we should be really careful in the use of these terms. And why we need to consider these two different sides of the coin when it comes to health and disease? Because as you can see in this picture, both sex and gender are equally relevant in shaping the health and disease of people. And in the majority of case, even though sex is not always included as biological variables in our study, the situation is even worse when it comes to gender. And when we are not including gender, we are really missing a big piece of the picture. But why is this the case? Why we, as a clinical scientist or practicing clinician, we are not used to consider gender in our practice? Because really the first hurdle is to understand the complexity and the multidimensionality that gender encompasses. Because as you can see, there are different domains that we should take into consideration to describe the gender of an individual, like the role, the identity, the relation in the society, and also the institutionalized gender, which is the distribution of forces and power inside the society between males and females. And even worse, we are a bit we have difficulties in really measuring gender because there is not a standardized method for doing so. And also, doing a step back, we need to consider that we commonly do not include such kind of variable in our clinical study. So I think that we should do more for the inclusion of gender and sex in our life science research. And as a clinical scientist, usually to answer my research question, I find myself in front of two possible scenarios. On one side, I can have already collected data sets available, and I can use this information, this data source, for answering my question, sex and gender-based question. Or I might be in the position of designing a new study for assessing prospectively the effect of gender on my outcome. Actually, nowadays, there is not a common pathway or roadmap to follow to integrate gender in this kind of research. And today I'm sharing with you my answer, which is the answer of the Going Forward Network. The Going Forward Network is really a multidisciplinary team of people that have an expertise and scientists in sex and gender-based analysis, lots of investigators from different countries in Europe and also in Canada. And as you can see here, really a key element for facing in the proper way all the challenges that sex and gender-based analysis pose is to have a multidisciplinary approach. So not only life sciences experts, but also computer scientists, social scientists, to achieve better science and to deal better with these issues. The main aim of our consortium is really to identify innovative way for integrate sex and gender domains in applied health research, and we want to assess the impact of such variable on clinical cost-sensitive outcome and patient-related outcome in a wide range of non-communicable chronic disease. We have access to several data sets, and we really want to advance the knowledge in this field. The first deliverable of our network project was to develop a standard methodology that all the researchers can use and apply to persisting cohort studies for the integration of gender in assessing their impact on health outcome. As you can see, there are 5 steps. For a matter of time, I cannot go through them, but for sure we can discuss later in the panel discussion. But just I want to tell you that to assist clinical scientists in this effort of implementation of gender in their research question, we provided a wish list of gender-related variables that you might find in your data sets, and that could be of relevance to include in your analysis plan. And then if you are instead in the position of starting a new study, also we provide, as going forward, a roadmap that clinicians can use to define all the steps for including properly in their design the sex and gender domains. Okay, once you have collected either retrospectively or prospectively this information about gender, how do you include them in your analysis plan? Once again, there is not a unique solution to this answer, to this question, but it depends really on the richness of your databases and on the research question you have. You can either compute a composite measure of gender if you have lots of variable, gender-based variable, or instead you can just assess the effect of individual factor, gender-related factor on your outcome. Let's see some example. This is a landmark paper that really provided a guidance on how to construct a composite measure of gender, a gender score. This is the results of the Genesis Praxis, which is a multi-center prospective, large observational study that enrolled young patient with premature acute coronary syndrome. As you can see, the Canadian investigator led by Dr. Pilot were able to identify 7 main items in their population that can be used for generating a propensity score for gender that goes from 0 to 100. And as you can see, females and males have really a wide distribution of gender, and there is also an area of overlapping. Why you should consider gender on top or beyond sex in your evaluation? Because it's going to change the relevance of your finding, and it will allow you to better stratify the outcome. Because if you look at just the sex disaggregated data in terms of outcome after 1 year of follow-up in this specific vulnerable course, you will see that there are no different in terms of incidence of adverse event. While if you stratify your population based on the gender score, you will see that, and you will identify those males and female with feminine characteristics, meaning characteristics that society traditionally ascribed to women. These patients are those that are more likely to experience adverse event in the follow-up. So really, gender can make a difference and predicts better clinical outcome when you apply this specific lens. And then as a going forward project, we also have a look about the effect of sex, gender on cardiovascular health, and we make multi-country comparison because we have accessibility to the Canadian Community Health Survey and to the Austrian Health Interview Survey, both collected in 2019. We used as exposure sex and a gender score that we were able to compute with the gender-related variable in these data sets, and then our outcome was really a measure of cardiovascular health, the CAN-HEART index and the HEAT-HEART index. As you can see, it's composed by 6 cardiometabolic risk factors. It ranges from 0 to 6, and the higher it is, the better is the cardiovascular health. As I showed you before, following the Genesis proxy methodology, we were able to construct a country-specific gender score for this population. And once again, you can see a wide distribution, a spectrum of gender across sexes that's different among the 2 countries. And then here we look at the distribution of the gender score based on the state of cardiovascular health. And once again, you can see that those patients that have more feminine characteristics with a higher gender score are those with the worse cardiovascular health. And when we try to assess the independent effect of sex, gender, or the cardiovascular risk factor on the development of overt heart disease, what we found was that in this young population, even though sex and having a better cardiometabolic risk profile was protective in terms of development of heart disease, you can see how the gender score really exerted a detrimental effect and was so strongly associated with cardiovascular diseases. And also in the comparison between the 2 groups, you can see that the magnitude of the effect was different and more pronounced in Austrian population. What about including instead just 1 domain? Here I'm providing you an example that the Going Forward investigator published recently regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and influence of sex and gender domains on cases and case fatality rate. We gather information about cases and case fatality using the data tracker of the Global Health 50/50 initiative that provided sex disaggregated data. As you can see, at the time of our analysis, only 33 countries provided this information, and this is really disappointing, considering how relevant and clear are the difference between females and male in terms of development and prognosis of this infection disease. As usual, we started with a conceptual framework on how gender may be related to differences prevalence on COVID-19 between males and female, and how gender could affect exposure and testing for the infection. And how we included gender in this research equation. We used the Gender Inequality Index, which is provided by the United Nations for each country, and is a measure of gender inequality in that country. It depends on the distribution of health, empowerment, and labor market between males and females, and those countries that have the higher gender inequality are really those that favor males over females. And as you can see here, the highest the gender inequality index is, the higher is the male to female ratio of positive cases. Why is this the case? It could be because there are differences in biological differences in risk factor between males and female, or it might be related to the different seeking care behavior that has been already showed in other conditions such as cardiovascular diseases. And finally, as already Dr. Vallat mentioned, gender champions in the field such as Professor Kara Tannenbaum on Londa Schimger, they really call for action and call for a structural change to implement sex and gender domains in clinical science and in research, also in other fields. We really need to value as funding agency, university, and dissemination tools, so peer-reviewed journal, the importance of providing sex disaggregated data, to provide gender disaggregated data, and to analyze the effect of this variable on outcome if we want to achieve better results and more better science. And then a topic of discussion that I'm sure we will be able to go deeper later is that I think that when it comes to artificial intelligence, if we do not feed properly our algorithms with sex and gender-based variable, we will never be able to achieve fair and equitable algorithms for predicting outcome. And I thank you, all of you, for the attention, and all the investigators that are working with me for advancing the integration of sex and gender in clinical study. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Valeria, for this overview on the relevance of sex and in particular gender factors in health and all the challenges that are associated with it. Thank you so much. Luis, your turn. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You can see my slides, right?
Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. So I'm Luis Rocha. So I'm from Indiana University, where I direct the Center for Social and Biomedical Complexity with my colleague Johan Bolin, that we see there in the image with a lot of the people. I'm also associated, as David said, with the Instituto Gulbenkian de Ciência in Portugal. So I'm going to do something a little different. So I'm going to start, I want to study bias and artificial intelligence and biomedical complexity, but I'm going to start from a general systems thinking way to frame the problem that I hope it's not too general and I hope can facilitate some discussions as we go forward. So when we do science in general, not just biomedical science, but also biomedical science, we go into the world and we decide to measure some observables in the world. We carve out a portion of the world that is of interest to us, and then what we do is to convert whatever we observe in the world and society, in nature and society, into some form of symbols and some form of images that we then assemble into some kind of formal model. This is what we call a scientific model. And therefore, so what we do in order to deal with predictions about the world is to study the logical consequences of this model rather than the world itself, right? So it's pretty obvious for how we do science. So the world is doing its own thing. We don't know how it's doing its own thing. Let me call it for shorthand natural laws, but we don't know actually how the world does its thing. And so the idea is that we have this correspondence between what really happens in the world versus these symbols, this data that we accumulate. And then we hope that our models match our observations in somehow. Perhaps the first person who actually studied this or put this in this precise form was Hertz. in which he really observed this correspondence between what really happens in the world versus our scientific models, our images, as he put it. And obviously we do this because we want to anticipate the future. That's the biggest reason why we do this model. Not only we want to understand, but we want to be able to prevent and predict what's going to happen in the world in the future. So many people have talked about this, particularly in the 20th century. I will just highlight, say, a famous physicist, Eugene Wigner, who is actually, he has a beautiful paper that I put there on the side, in which he actually marvels, why does this even work? Why would we expect mathematical models, formal models, to even be able to sort of predict the world in any way? And there are issues with that. In particular, he immediately picked one that was every empirical law has the disquieting quality that one does not know its limitations. So I'm going to talk this because I think bias is a limitation of how we model the world, and so let me dig a little bit more into how this works. So I think, especially if we're given the talks that we just heard, we all agree here that the world is a complex set of phenomena. It's contextual, it's multi-layered, especially in biomedicine. It goes all the way from the molecular to the organ, to the human, to the social, to the technological, to even the political. And so we all agree that the world is complex. So how do we study it? So the first piece of good news that allow us to tackle this complexity was perhaps articulated by Herb Simon in 1962, where he observed, even though we have all this complexity, for the largest part, we can approach the world with fairly simple methods because the world is kind of hierarchical. In other words, there are a subset of observables or variables that are actually quite nicely encapsulated, and then we can carve out and choose to not include other variables because most of the time they don't affect the system that we are interested in studying. Those other variables could perhaps work at a different time scale, or perhaps they just very rarely influence your system of study. So this is, by and large, how we still go about studying complex systems. It's very in vogue to find modularity structure on systems so that we can understand those things that are more interrelated with one another than with other variables. And therefore, we use this to carve out categories and classes that allow us to study things separately from others. And by and large, this is work. This is one of the biggest things that people do in science. I'm just pointing out one of my favorite papers from Marta Sales Pardo there in Tarragona, in which he looked at protein networks, for instance, and find the modularity in the hierarchical structure of protein interaction networks. So that's, by and large, we can do that. Another piece of good news that scientists use for the longest time is based on empiricism. It goes even before this. David Hume, the idea that the future really is predicted by the past, and that what we observe about the past tells us something about the future, and we can use induction to predict the future or predict or understand the world. So putting this back in the Hertz way, so what we do by induction is that we use a lot of examples for a particular system, and from there generate a rule, which is typically cast as some kind of model with statistical regularity. This is, for all of those of you who do AI and machine learning, this is how machine learning works. So machine learning is a process of automating this sort of induction process that we talk about, where we feed a lot of examples, a lot of data to models that find these statistical regularities and then allow us to do prediction. So everything you're used to in machine learning, classification, and regression falls into this. And so this works really well when the world functions like this, right? So for instance, things like the sun, we can always predict that it rises in the east and it will set in the west. So therefore, what you previously observed is very good about predicting what you observe in the future. So putting these two pieces of good news together, it gives us the ability to model complex systems, even though they're multi-layered, even though they're contextual, we can still tackle them because we assume, as Herb Simon, that they are what he called near decomposable, that we can carve out these modules in hierarchies, and also that the past follows from the future follows from the past. So, of course, especially in the second half of the 20th century, people have been pointing that, there are complex systems that go far beyond this. These are probably what we would call simple systems. And so let me show you how this comes about. Of course, we know that AI and all sorts of other induction techniques always have to be based on a kind of a leap, an inductive leap. We are always sort of assuming that the past will predict the future, but this might not work so well, or the data that we have, because as famously Karl Popper has observed, your induction is dictated by your previous observations, is actually biased by your previous observations. So whatever data you have collected up to the past will bias what you are predicting about the future. And this is usually put, as Karl Popper did, with this metaphor of the swans, in which for the longest time, Europeans always thought that all swans are white because only white swans existed in Europe. It took Europeans to arrive to Australia to realize that there was a black swan, right? So if you were just following an induction process, you will generalize by a rule that all swans are white, when in truth, there are black swans. So Popper used this to say that we can never prove a theory, that we can only falsify it by an inductive theory. We can only falsify it. But here you can see immediately how this is related to some of the conversations we had so far. In many ways, in biomedical research, the data was biased towards men, and women were somewhat like of a black swan in biomedical research, that we didn't expect the changes that we have observed. Another piece of bad news for the approach that I was mentioning has to do that, going back to this multi-layer systems, is that we can observe, especially in biological organization, they are not that neatly boxed out. It's very easy to find in biomedicine in instances where lower levels affect greatly or control higher levels. If anything, the pandemic that we are observing is a great example in which we have a zoonotic event that passed from virus to human, and from this it affected tremendously all the levels above, not just our health, but our societies, even our politics, our social, or our economy, right? So you can see that it's not that easy to carve out in a hierarchical structure all these levels to study. This was first observed by Howard Patty, which was one of my advisors, in his book, Hierarchy Theory, The Challenge of Complex Systems, in which his key insight that complex systems are not reducible to these Simon-like hierarchies that are self-contained, these boxed mechanisms, nor are they easily predicted from past data, because these events can be quite rare. These events that from a lower level that control the next level are actually usually very rare, and you don't observe them by induction very easily in your data. And this was also at the same time by another theoretical biologist, Robert Rosen, also that was working with Howard Patty in his book Anticipatory Systems, actually observed that any inductive model, mechanistic inductive model of a truly complex system will eventually deviate from your observation. This is what he called a model failure. So when you look at these inductive data, sooner or later, they're going to fail with some observation. So their insight from this is that in addition to inductive models, complex systems always need a kind of multi-level actionable models and theory. We need to have a higher level theoretical underpinning where we can predict things, or we can consider things that we don't even observe. We have to not just be circumscribed to an inductive sort of analysis of data. More recently, this became very in fashion again by the work of Nassim Taleb, especially coming back with the idea of black swans. In my view, he's recapitulating what Robert Rosen and Howard Petty did in the 1970s in theoretical biology, but Taleb comes from more of a financial expertise, and indeed what he says is basically true. So just positioning what these guys said back into the Hertzian way of seeing things is a little more complex than the way Hertz was seeing. The world is, and there's the specter of Popper there too, the world is more complex than we usually think. And in particular, there are often unknown variables that we are not observing when we build our black box model that can make us, that give rise to these black swan events that then make our observations fail. This is very easily seen in many famous approaches to artificial intelligence. For instance, I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail of this, but there's this famous case of Google flu that predicted very well flu outbreaks for a certain amount of time and then failed miserably. And if you want to know how this is sort of like a black swan event because of an intrinsic failure, a system failure, that did not track the changes in the search mechanisms of Google, please read this paper by Alessandro Vespignani and David Lazar, where this is sort of outlined why it failed. So now, coming back to medicine and not just this or use of AI in diverse societies and see how this leads into biases, we all know that because of the data that we use for our induction mechanisms, and AI is nothing more than an automated induction technique, we are all familiar with the way these systems fail. For instance, these facial recognition systems from Microsoft and IBM are much better at predicting white male faces than they are at darker female faces, because in the tech domain, they have a lot more white men to try to test the data than they did dark females, right? So they did much worse at predicting the features of females because of that data. Even more dangerously, there's this famous case of a system to predict risk that was assisting police in some training situations, where people with these sort of very similar or exact same prior offenses were actually given much higher risk when they were just because of their race. So if they were black, they were given a much higher risk for having very similar past offenses, or even worse than white people, because they were trained on police data, which is itself biased. So in our own work, we have looked at these sorts of biases in data, analyzing very large records of electronic health records. This is a collaboration with a postdoc in my group, Rion Correia, and where we looked at the entire population of a city in Brazil, in Blumenau, and we built the drug interactions that exist, that are known but are still prescribed to patients, even though we know they are drug interactions. And we separated them by gender and found out that women are prescribed a lot more interactions. So one thing that it's important to see here in this first plot, you see that when we look at simultaneous prescription of medication, there's hardly no difference between men and women. So the risk of being given more than one drug at a time as you age is the same for men and women. But when you look at the risk of known interactions, females have a much higher risk, especially in this data set, after 45, 50 years old, of being prescribed known interactions. Now, of course, one of the questions that we deal here in this workshop is this a social or a biomedical bias that exists here, and how do we separate both of them? And towards that, towards having this kind of theoretical underpinning that I was talking earlier, that allow us to reason about the inductions we do from these data, we started recently a collaboration with Alfonso Valencia and John Sanchez Valles and others, and I apologize for not having their photos here, but these are the people I interact most with. we started comparing the data from Brazil to data in all the electronic records of Catalonia, and also data we obtained from Indianapolis, which is a private system. The other two are public systems, to see if this thing that we had observed in Blumenau of females having a much higher risk than males is observed in the other ones. And we see that in Catalonia is not as prevalent, but it's still a bias for females, but it does have a bias in earlier ages that you don't even see in Blumenau. For instance, it's not clear completely why females have such a higher risk than males from 15 to 25. In the United States, there's an interesting switch that males become, after a certain age, become more problematic. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, and we can discuss this more. The point of this comparative analysis is to try to allow us to differentiate what is social from what is biological, and what is actually a feature of the economics of each one of these different systems that we can go in detail. But we also want to move towards modeling to have actionable interventions. What can we do to prevent this? So for instance, Jan very recently started looking at this, and if you remove a single drug from the data set in Catalonia, omeprazole, and substitute it by other proton inhibitors that exist in the market, you reduce the risk to females a lot. And the males also reduces, but you actually get a little closer just by removing that drug and putting another one of a similar class. So putting back this, and almost to finalize, putting all this back into shape, what I'm advocating here is not that we stop using induction and data science and AI and all of that, is that we use that for we use induction only for parameter estimation of models and theoretical models at a higher level. So for instance, the example we just saw of considering gender as a variable is a theoretical underpinning of data that we might observe. And this allows us then to test unobserved scenarios that even are very rare of observation and see what they would mean for our data set. So we still have induction, but we do induction more as a means to inform our actionable models. And to finalize, I'll give you an example of the type of model from systems biology that we like to work. This is a breast cancer model, estrogen receptor plus a model that was built by Rekha Albert, and that we have. And so just to very quickly say, these models are built by huge amounts of induction from all the literature, all the multi-omic databases. Every edge here is data from many labs and many experiments. But once we make these network models, we are then able to query them theoretically, and we provided a technique to actually look at the interactions of medications into how to either kill the cancer cells to lead them to apoptosis or stop them from proliferating. And for instance, identified that 3 drugs do nothing to this type of cancer in this kind of work. But this allows us to play with scenarios that are not even observed. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of this work, and I'll finalize. This is a very recent paper of ours. If you're interested in reading how we sort of use these models to have a causal alternative strategies analysis of cancer in this case, and read this paper. And so for now, this is it, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Luis. Thank you so much for guiding us through the foundation of the formal models that are at the basis of artificial intelligence systems, and also the insight that we can get from complex systems in order to overcome bias and prevent it. Thank you so much. Silvina, you can share the screen. Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, and we can see the slides. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for having me in this wonderful seminar for this very relevant topic. I'm also very honored to share the panel with these outstanding speakers that have provided their different perspectives from the clinical domain, from the biomedical research, and also from a much more mathematical and computational perspective. So I'm Silvina. Davide introduced me earlier. So I come from the biomedical research world, but after my time in academia, I spent quite some time in the private sector, in the pharmaceutical sector, and also I have been working in the technology sector, specifically for digital health interventions. I'm part of the World Health Organization roster of experts in digital health, and I'm also part of the Women's Brain Project. So I am particularly interested in this topic of sex and gender perspective and personalized medicine. I believe that by now everyone must be convinced that personalized medicine is all about understanding the individual differences among patients and using these individual differences to better provide the diagnosis and to better provide a treatment. And the key of personalized medicine is to provide an accurate profiling of individuals based on their specific characteristics, then to stratify the population according to their different specific features, and then to deliver the right interventions that are tailored to the specific clusters of individuals in order to provide the best possible health outcomes and the best possible effects of these interventions. And basically, this is a very interesting and promising and ambitious approach of personalized medicine that requires also a very deep understanding, as very nicely Luis was referring to, of a multi-level understanding of health and disease, starting from the genes, but also going forward to the physiology and also understanding the social and the behavioral dynamics of an individual. Because as the World Health Organization properly stands, health is not only the absence of disease, but is a complete and general state of physical, mental, and social well-being. And during the last period, the last couple of decades, actually there has been a great progress on our understanding of human health and human diversity at many of these different levels. But actually, the sex and gender differences, that is our primarily focus today, remains as a big gap and remains to be explored in many different areas. It is something that we know that has an impactful effect in health, both directly and indirectly. We know that the biological sex has, through the different gene expression and hormone differences, it has an effect on the way that some diseases perform some clinical manifestations, and also the way that individuals respond to specific treatments. And we also know that at the more like a social cultural gender level, there are also some effects. There are associated differences at the level of some more like lifestyle behaviors, for example, at the level of nutrition and exercise and smoking and stress, that in turn have an effect at the epigenetic level. They provoke some epigenetic modifications that are related with health. On the other hand, we know that the sociocultural gender also is associated with some behaviors related with health, such as help seeking, and also the use of healthcare, and also the therapeutic response in terms of, for example, some adherence to the prescription of interventions. And all these sex and gender differences actually are manifested in how difference in the prevalence of diseases and also the causes of death are distributed across male and female individuals. One very relevant difference that this is remarkable is the higher rate of suicide, for example, in male individuals. But on the other hand, it is also very relevant, I think it was previously mentioned by Carmen, the higher prevalence of Alzheimer's disease and also stroke in female individuals. These are just a few examples, but actually there are many, many more. But one of the reasons why we are all here today is because technology has been going through a huge progress during the last decades. That's one of the reasons why Barcelona Supercomputing Center is so engaged also with this particular topic. And during these last decades, there has been a huge progress on the development of a variety of technologies that are helping us to understand these inter-individual differences among patients and different people. And some of these technologies are involved with the collection and the analysis of different type of data sets. For example, omics data sets that are related with the genome, the proteome, some metabolomics, and this type of very biomedical type of data sets. Then we have data sets more related with technology, biosensors that are informative of the health status of the person. Also some technologies related with the storage and the analysis of electronic medical records, about also cognitive function and the way that we interact with our digital devices, the way that we can automatize the analysis of clinical images, and also the way that we can analyze social behavior of individuals. On top of all this, there are also some technologies that are able to provide remote monitoring and delivery of digital therapeutic interventions that are really making a big impact these days, particularly with the pandemic. And very importantly, there are technologies that can give us predictions of the health outcomes of particular individuals given their specific characteristics. So all these technologies are really giving us very wide type of opportunities to implement the personalized medicine approach throughout the lifespan of individuals, across the whole life in different stages of their conditions. For example, in the early stages, these technologies can help to provide interventions that are focused on prevention and for enhancement of their wellness and well-being. Later on, some technologies can help to provide an accurate and early diagnosis of conditions. And of course, they also can help clinicians to make decisions and to design the type of healthcare interventions and to monitor the symptoms throughout the diseases that patients are experimenting for the management of these patients that sometimes they are suffering from chronic conditions. So these are very powerful technologies, and these are for sure technologies that are going to revolutionize the future of medicine. But the tricky thing about these technologies and involving artificial intelligence as well is that they can act as a double-edged sword. And this is something that we have exposed in our paper that we published last year together with the Women's Brain Project and the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And what we mean by this is that on one hand, these technologies, if created created without removing biases and also confounding factors, they can worsen the health disparities. They can even perpetuate some of these sex and gender inequalities that currently exist. And on the other hand, if we create these technologies in a way that we incorporate the sex and gender differences, they can promote the right way to establish the personalized medicine that we are all interested in. So here, I'm going to give you a few examples of how these two sides of the coin or two edges of the sword have been substantiated. So here on the top, I'm bringing you this example that is an algorithm that uses X-ray images in order to diagnose thoracic diseases. And what happened was that it had a much worse performance for females in comparison to males. And the reason was that the data set that was used to train and to construct this algorithm was not using a representative sample of the different conditions across male and female. And then I'm bringing you here another example that is about a model for hip replacement surgery that did not take into account the differences in female bone structure, leading to poorer outcomes in females, in women going through this type of interventions. And in the third one here, I'm bringing you the pulse oximeter. That is this device to measure the oxygenated blood, which is having less accurate measurement in both women and men of color, leading to misdiagnosis and wrong measurements for people having, for example, hypoxemia. So in these three examples, I'm showing you how, in these cases, these technologies actually can provide disadvantages for a specific sociodemographic or minority group. But on the other hand, in some cases, actually, when designed properly, these technologies can be really helpful. And I'm bringing you here, the first example is about the use of artificial intelligence in order to diagnose the risk of neurodevelopmental disorders, considering genome and also clinical data sets that were disaggregated by sex. And this is really elucidating a lot of the mechanisms that are possibly related with this heterogeneity in neurodevelopmental disorders like autistic spectrum disorders and so on. Second one here is the AWARE-DX, that is an algorithm for the prediction of the drug response and also secondary effect, adverse effects of drugs, but differences of these effects between men and women in the context of drug development and also drug repurposing and drug pharmacogenetic studies. So this algorithm has shown a lot of accuracy, and it's very useful in order not to include in the market some drugs that will then show secondary effects, for example, in one particular group. That is what has been happening throughout the years lately. And then here, the third example is an algorithm for the diagnosis of COVID-19 based on only 4 parameters, and one of them was particularly sex, and was very relevant because of all the differences that have been shown with sex in the type of symptoms and the severity of the illness, particularly for death. So as you can see, there are these two sides, let's say, of technology. And as I mentioned before, last year, in order to reflect our thoughts and our perspective on this topic, we published, together with Women's Brain Project and the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, as well as many other institutions, this paper in which we propose this framework that illustrates how the use of artificial intelligence in biomedicine needs to incorporate these good practices so that they can reduce all these undesirable biases that are really going to sustain all the health inequalities that exist currently on sex and gender. And on the other side, to enhance the desirable differences and to really be used in order to understand what are the biological and sociocultural factors that are related with these sex and gender differences in health and disease, in order to really be able to apply this personalized medicine approach. And many of these good practices and part of actually this solution basically are relying on two things that are one, having representative data sets, representative and diverse data sets that are going to be coming both from the preclinical and the clinical settings in order to create finally these algorithms that need to be transparent and that need to be trustworthy in order to really ensure that we are achieving this balance between the undesirable and the desirable biases. So this is something, these areas, these challenges are something that they still need a lot of work, and there are a lot of things that really need to be addressed in order to solve it. But fortunately, there are many initiatives all over the world that are tackling these challenges. And here I'm bringing you just a few examples that I am very excited about. These examples actually are coming from very diverse angles. They are coming from the whole research and technology and healthcare ecosystem. So, for example, here from the governmental and funding agencies, last year there was this publication of a report on gender innovation that is raising awareness of all the issues around ignoring sex and gender, not only in terms of biomedical and healthcare, but also across many different industries. And also from the European Commission as well, there is a lot of effort and a lot of investment that is around the creation of guidelines for trustworthy AI. And both these type of initiatives are going to soon be translated into regulations and policies that are going to enforce the changes that are really going to achieve this proper data diversity and trustworthy algorithms. Then on the more academic side of things and consortiums, I would like to mention this project, this initiative that is a very collaborative work from 23 countries that is aiming at having by next year sequenced more than 1 million genomes. And this is really going to create a network of health data together with genome data, and it's really going to provide an outstanding basis for personalized medicine. I also would like to mention here, particularly from Barcelona, a project that is about the creation of a precision medicine hub that is part of the Ciudadela del Conocimiento project. And right now, this is a project that is in the very early stages, and the buildings are being constructed for this. But in the coming years, I'm sure that this precision medicine hub is going to provide very valuable insights, and it's going to be very helpful to move the whole discipline forward. And then here I'm going to give you just very briefly some hints from the more industry side of things. So this initiative is of particular interest for me because it's on neurodegenerative disorder, the Davos Alzheimer Collaborative. This is a public-private partnership, and it's aiming at making an atlas of Alzheimer's disease by creating global cohorts across the world, including people suffering from Alzheimer's disease from very different socio-demographic backgrounds. And the aim is to identify the heterogeneity to better tackle the symptoms and to possibly create the more effective treatments in the short term. In the last example here, I'm going to give you more like a general impression of the general trend in the pharmaceutical sector and also in the technology, more like startup sector, that is that most of these institutions and companies and entities are going to way of working that is going beyond the pill, moving away from only drug development and going into the creation of solutions that are trying to achieve these 5 rights. That means to provide the right drug to the right patient at the right time, the right dose, and through the right route. And this is for sure very, very at the core of personalized and precision medicine. And I'm sure like these type of initiatives, all of these ones that I'm mentioning here, but many more, are going to provide the right path for personalized medicine if they are also including the sex and gender perspective. So last but not least, I would like to just very briefly mention that we are just about to get our book published. This is again work by the Women's Brain Project together with the Barcelona Supercomputing Center and other well-known institutions. This is a book that is specifically about sex and gender bias in artificial intelligence for biomedicine, and we are covering a number of very relevant topics within this subject. So I encourage everyone interested in this area to stay tuned because we are going to get it published very soon around August. And with that, thank you so much. And I will be happy to start with the panel discussion.
Exactly. Thank you, Silvina, for outlining the relationship between the individual differences and technology, not only highlighting the risk of propagating inequalities, but also like the great potential and the benefits of doing things right, and also the initiatives and the work that is ongoing in this direction worldwide. So yes, we have to quick transition to the panel discussion. So I would just like starting saying that, in my opinion, something that emerged from your presentation is definitely the interdisciplinarity that is required to achieve an unbiased precision medicine. And this is, of course, very much into the nature of this multi-layered understanding of health and disease that we are trying to achieve. So for these reasons, like given your different backgrounds and this interdisciplinarity, I would like to start by asking to each one of you, when in your professional trajectory did you face for the first time the problem of sex and gender misrepresentation in the health domain? I will start with Carmen.
¿Sí? Bueno, yo...
Well, I was engaged for the first time when I was finishing my medicine studies, and during all the medicine studies, no one taught me about menstruation. So it was only an hour. So can you hear me properly?
So.
¿No tengo el micro puesto?
Yes. Now
¿Sí?
There are technical problems. We are.
Cierro esto. ¿Y ahora? ¿Me oís?
Can you hear me now?
Pues...
Well, I was telling you that I began to work in this field since I realized that during my studies no one told me about menstruation. And by that time, in Spain, we didn't have all these studies and many other ways for you to find different sources of information. I went to Madrid at the endocrinology Ibero-American medicine school, and I wanted to study in depth the menstruation cycle. Suddenly I realized that there were no studies, and we held the first conference of women and quality of life in Barcelona in 1990, and I introduced my thesis about mortality. Valeria, what's your story?
Valeria, can you hear us? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in my case, I guess it started when I was an MD student, and every time I was told that in my clinical reasoning, diagnostics process, and prescription of drugs, I should take into consideration the findings of the randomized controlled trial. And so I start that are also the evidence that are used for providing guidelines for the treatment. And then I discovered that when I applied that recommendation, sometimes I unfortunately incur in no efficacy of drugs in women and or a higher proportion of adverse events. And then I came back to the randomized controlled trial, and I discovered that there was really a low proportion of women enrolled, meaning that my practice was not evidence-based. And that was my first experience as a practicing clinician on how biased is the evidence that we have from randomized controlled trial.
Thank you. Luis.
Yes, Luis.
Okay, so I'm not a woman, so I did not face it personally. I'd like to first say that. So I bow down to all the women in the panel to discuss that. I will say that I first encountered this. I was working in the early 2000s in Los Alamos, at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in a functional genomics project. And like many people mentioned here, we realized that a lot of our data sets from clinical trials had many more women than women in what we are analyzing. I mean, I want to bring another point for this, that it's beyond gender, right? So at Los Alamos too, I was very, it was in our face that there was a horrible history there of making medical experiments with Native Americans, for instance. So the biases that existed there they were very visible to me. There was a historical nature to that, and that's the one thing I would point here also, that we really have to look at the context. Some of these things do not translate from one country to another, whether we look at gender, where we look at race. In particular, for instance, my experience in the United States is that of a Latino, which has its own biases, but when I'm in Portugal or in Spain, I'm one of the dominant white males. So the context in which one operates is very important. I think we also have to be very careful about generalizing the experiences as we go from one place to another and one data set to another. So that's why we like these comparative cross-national approaches. So.
Yes, I was saying definitely, I totally agree. And Silvina, what is your story?
Yes, so basically my story to face for the first time this sex and gender misrepresentation was when I was doing my PhD. I did a lot of experimental work with animal models of disease, particularly with models of Down syndrome, and the very vast majority of scientific articles was published with male mice. So my project actually started by having both male and female mice. And I wanted to carry on doing everything, all my different experiments with the male and female mice. I ended up with these 16 experimental groups that wasn't really sustainable. And finally, at the last stage, I kept only my female mice, which actually represented a challenge, because whenever I had to compare my results with the rest of the results of the literature, they were not fully comparable. So that kept me thinking quite a lot about this sex representation of preclinical studies. And later on, so I kept on thinking about this, and this was something I was very interested in also because of neurological and psychiatric conditions show a huge difference of prevalence and symptom manifestation between men and women. And that's why then I joined the Women's Brain Project, and I have been working in the subject for several years now.
Silvina, I'm also a member of the Women's Brain Project, and Silvina and I, of course, collaborate on this topic. We are the first co-authors of the paper she was mentioning. So I would like to consider again this relevance, this importance of the context that Louise was mentioning before. And I would like to ask Valeria, so do you think that gender medicine, I mean, it's clear that it's a gateway to precision medicine, but as we were saying before, like, the context is really important. So it's not just the two categories of women and men, but we also have to intersect a lot more in order to really have a precision medicine, to realize a precision medicine approach. So what do you think about this?
So for sure, as we all mentioned, I guess we need to overcome this binary thinking way, and we need to look at sex and gender intersection more as a spectrum. And I totally agree with Louise that it's really relevant to take into consideration how much gender especially is country cultural based, and how some biological factors can have a different effect on health depending on the country where you live, on the culture you have. As Louise, I also have been living in other countries, and I totally agree that it's really make the difference where you live and the environment. Then if it parts of the epigenetic modulation and biological factors, or if it's all about lifestyle behaviors, really we cannot disentangle too much these two aspects, but I really think that it's important to look at the intersection between them, and also to see how this intersection between sex and gender feels and a match with other characteristics such as race, socioeconomic status, religion, and so on, because really health, as it's not just the absence of a disease, it's the complete well-being in biology, social, and mental health.
Okay, and along these lines, I would like to ask Louise, so what are the risks associated to not including the sex and gender perspective in biomedical research and clinical practice? In particular, thinking on artificial intelligence and their applications, no? So the risks of not including this perspective in the design and the development, what we are facing if we are not addressing those issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be comprehensive on this because there's, of course, a lot of risks. But so I'll bring out some of what I did in my presentation. By not including a theoretical underpinning of where you're working, and also by not including diversity in your teams in which you work, you're probably not even considering questions that you should be asking. So if you are using AI and machine learning, because as I outlined, they're automatic induction machines. There's a big tendency to just trust the data that you have because the data speaks. That's what we do in data science, right? So it becomes even more important to question systematically what you obtained from this, whether it's with the inclusion of null models. And I find that particularly when you build null models, which is something we bring a lot from physics, right, to do this, it works much better when you have people with different perspectives in your team, that they come and say, well, have you considered this, right? Because as we were just talking, we live in different countries. We might not even consider what are the issues of Native Americans, say, if you're not in the United States, and therefore, so these questions you ask are very important for this. I would draw attention to a paper from a couple of years ago from Akiko Iwasaki at Yale. She's an immunologist, and said why we need to increase diversity in the immunology research community. And she means diversity not just in gender, but in all aspects, so that we can question this. I will also finalize with one thing. I mean, listening to you guys speak is very refreshing, but it is actually interesting when you go to, say, to other conferences on gender, in which it's almost a no-no, it's almost taboo to talk about biological differences between the genders, or because it's so we have to be aware that we work in a realm where this is very problematic for many other people to even talk about those differences. So, but at the same time, that's the positive thing, because our field, let's face it, has had some bad names that have mentioned some things about biological determinants of behavior and intelligence that people are very afraid to go there. So I think it's very important that we do this very well, so that we can honestly speak about the biological differences while accepting the social constructions aspect. So that's why I thought it was the work that Silvina and Valeria were very cool, because you are addressing both the biological and also the social aspects of this, and rather than running away from it. So I do think there's a positive perspective here. Rather than talking about risks, as you asked me, I'm talking about the possibilities, which is, I think, what's cool about what we can do is that we can sort of resolve some of these issues.
Yes, but I mean, it's also like extremely important the point that you are raising about the acceptance, no, and the way this research, no, is also communicated, especially to the layman and to the public audience, no, and how, if it's really understood. And this is always like a stigma that if you think thoroughly, it's I mean, it's a risk also inherent in precision medicine, if you want, like placing people in boxes, no, and this is really not well seen. So most of the time you don't see the benefit of it, but you only see that this might create problems and conflict and discrimination. So of course, I don't know if some of you would like to add something to this point of the acceptance of what we are doing here in the public. No one? No thoughts?
No.
Okay. Yes, we really need to be careful now on the way we communicate things and then to do things right. So, Carmen, I would like to ask you. So you showed in your presentation that a lot of studies, new studies, are coming out about sex differences, and so I would like to know how mature is the status of this discipline, let's call it gender medicine, beyond reproductive medicine, or what are the medical branches and specialties that are the most promising, let's say, the ones for which there is more evidence?
Yeah.
Well, it's not quite a mature situation, if I'm frank with you, because in everything that has to do with reproductive health, not only reproductive health, I'm talking about the natural, specific women lives all along their lives, menstruation, being pregnant, after being pregnant, and all the different troubles that a woman can suffer. has been reduced. It has been one of the areas in medicine that has experienced a great leap in 2000, 2002 and 3, and suddenly disappeared in a global media. In all the research works and articles, because the majority of medical intervention has not to do with better analyzing menstruation and all the different contexts related, stress related, the environment, as well as the polychlorarium and all the chemicals that has a role and impact on menstruation. Suddenly we forget menstruation with all the drugs, the hormone drugs, and all the contraceptive and medicines, and we don't study. After pregnancy, we have several troubles with the thyroid. 25% of women suffer. We call it post-pregnancy depression, and we do not treat in a proper manner. Due to the environmental effects, we have a hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism after pregnancy, and suddenly we treat women that something different. We want them to have menstruation without knowing that it is not needed after a pregnancy, because we scientifically know that we can keep bone health without needing to introduce hormones that will produce breast cancer and other coronary issues. So we are not in a very mature situation. Therefore, that everything that has to do with AI can help us to better manage. And I do agree with you, Luis. I do agree with you, because we cannot deny that we can witness biological differences favoring those people that want to get hormones because they have a different gender identity. But they must think that liver will change because they will take a certain drug. XY or XX human being liver will metabolize the hormones the way the hormones have to metabolize. And this can have an impact, just when we talk about the transition between women that wants to be men, they suffer a problem because the testosterone going to a woman liver will be an estrogen. So there are some elements that science will help us to better understand. But this is not a stop for people to change gender. But from a biological perspective, we can see that we have 43 proteins in our body that rely on different cells that are different between men and women. The mesencephalic barrier is also different between men and women. So the knowledge will help us to better treat or not to treat, because sometimes it's better not to treat.
Going back to artificial intelligence, so I would like to ask Silvina, do you think that the current use of artificial intelligence in health is creating new risks of magnifying inequalities and discrimination? I would actually I'm interested in the current state. So artificial intelligence, how it is developed right now, is creating those problems, those issues, and what can be done?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that in a way, this double-edged sword type of framework is showing both the good side of artificial intelligence, and we all agree that it is very promising and powerful, but the dark side of it is that actually there are lots of ways in which artificial intelligence is creating more inequalities. And actually we are seeing several examples of this, not only in the healthcare domain, but also in the criminal justice. For example, whenever algorithms are used to assess and predict additional criminal harassment by people, and sometimes these are actually harmful and these are providing disadvantages for minorities. And I think that Luis mentioned some of this in his presentation. And also they are being shown a similar type of algorithm discrimination in other sectors, like for example, in terms of loans, whenever an algorithm is used in order to decide whether a candidate is good for a bank to release a loan. And sometimes these are not good predictions and are disadvantages for certain minorities, and they are unfair. So also, you know, a lot of these type of examples in which technology is used in a way that is raising inequalities are very highlighted in the media. So that leads to a lot of people to be concerned and to be afraid of how technology can be used for things that are going to be potentially harmful for them. And yeah, I definitely agree that technology, in the end of the day, it's a mirror to our society, and is using the data sets that are mirroring the way that we are collecting the data sets. And sometimes we are collecting data sets in a wrong way, not because we are evil, but because we are not paying attention to all these potential confounding factors. It's like Luis was mentioning, the black swan. It's like, I'm sure like we are half of the population women, but we were still not considered, we are black swans, and nobody really paid attention to it. So similar things can happen in all over the place, and these are creating potential hazards in technology.
Thank you. And regarding this, I would like to ask Carmen and also Valeria about the cognitive biases, so that can be also present in the doctor, and how this can affect the medical practice, and as Silvina was mentioning, even the data collection. So Carmen first.
Sí.
Yes. It is very, very tricky. It is very tricky to change stereotypes and models because they belong to us. And it's something very intimate when we assess our own behavior and our personal perspective. I can see much more possibilities in younger generations, medical professionals, researchers. They are just these young generations. They are much aware about gender stereotypes. They suffer themselves this kind of discriminations, and they have in mind that everything can change. However, we must boost these new technologies. The Canadian standard, as well as the National Investigation Health in the US, that Healy said in 1993. He said that all research papers had to include women, men, and different ethnic minorities. This was quite a big progress. So, with the public funds, we couldn't accept to partially investigate. And through these public policies, let's work in order to make things invisible visible. And suddenly, we must see the bias of diagnosis. Suddenly, we do not properly translate the laboratory results. And these data will be introduced as very important data. But if they are biased, if we still consider that it's common in women and it's normal them not to have enough iron, we still have this gender bias, because iron should be at the same level for men and women. Why women should have less iron? It's much more frequent, but the frequent things are not normal. And to change this mindset, it's very tough, because all medicine schools, they teach that what is frequent, it's normal. Gender violence, it's frequent, but it's not normal, right? Why do we have to tolerate that everything that is frequent to be normal? Why do we have to accept that women suffering anemia, it's normal because it's frequent? Or Alzheimer, women, they suffer much more Alzheimer than men, and we don't know why. Let's try to look for near-risk factors. Very difficult to change.
Also about this, the presence of the effect of cognitive bias in medical practice. And Valeria, can you hear us?
Could you please repeat your question?
Ara.
Yes, I would like to. I would like to ask you to comment on the presence of cognitive biases, like for instance gender stereotypes, that can affect the medical practice and even the data collection.
Okay, so for sure, as already Carmen mentioned, the problem is that when we are medical students, the young generation are trained by big picture, big clinical scenario. What I'm trying to do now as a professor, every time I give a clinical picture, I ask to the student, my colleagues, would you be different your clinical reasoning if the person you have in front of you is a man or a woman or a gender diverse people? And then they stop and they start to reflect that there are some differences, and if they do not take into consideration these differences, they can also achieve the wrong diagnosis or maybe give more relevance to an aspect that is more frequent, as Carmen said, in males or in females, because the disparities is for both women and males. I really don't want that the message here is that we want to take care of individuals independently by their sex, their gender, whatever. So we want to really change the mindset of the young generation. But as we mentioned before, we need really also an effort from university and the education system to make more transdisciplinary the integration of gender medicine across all the specialties, because it's not a new specialty. Yeah. It's an approach that should be used independently by your specialty, the disease or whatever, because it fits and it applies to everything.
Yes, yes, definitely. So, since we are running out of time, I would like to ask the organization if there are some questions from the audience. So
yes, we do have some questions from the audience. La primera sería para la...
The first one is for Dr. Valls. They ask you whether you could talk about the lack of clinical trials for pregnant women, the lack of clinical trials for pregnant women. Yeah, this was a problem which aroused when we had the thalidomide, which generated congenital malformations so severe that they stopped the clinical trials on pregnant women. And it is a problem of an ethical nature, but at the same time, and we have seen this with the pandemic, that it was essential also to know whether a vaccine could produce an effect or another. So it is a problem that brings together the ethics with the need to research. And in this sense, what we need is to have more rigor, more rigorous in the design of the clinical trial. But yes, it is a loophole, it is a breach, it is a gap that we need to bridge, but we have some more gaps to bridge. We're failing to study, for example, the evolution of the proteins in blood during the menstrual cycle, or whether the cholesterol should be measured at one point or the other. But obviously, pregnant women is a gap. A bit related to what you mentioned before, now we're talking a lot about the AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines and the problem they are generating in women, but this is not commented too much. And then we have also the subject of the adverse effects it's having, which are higher in the case of contraceptives, which are commonly prescribed to women. Yes, this is a paradox, because when, for example, in the GAPS group, in some of the medicines you're going to see, we denounce the secondary effect of the contraceptives, which is unknown. And right now, all the media are talking about the fact that the contraceptives can generate thrombosis when it is not the cause for the problem of the vaccine. I can intervene saying that what's going on with the thrombosis of the vaccine is an autoimmune problem, which doesn't have anything to do, or relatively, it's not directly related to taking contraceptives or not. Women are more prone to having that than men, and this is something we can see in the literature because of different drugs, and there are 38 drugs that can generate this thrombosis, similar to heparin, because women, as I explained at the beginning, are more predisposed to autoimmune illnesses. Firstly, because they have more defenses against infections, as it's being proved with the pandemic. We have always said that women have a different immunity, which is prolonged over time, and against infections. I think that's one of the reasons why the life expectancy is higher. But there is a double-edged sword in these defenses, because then autoimmunity is more frequent among women. So we need to pay close attention to the evolution of any drug you introduce in the women's body.
The audience, hello.
Hello. First of all, congratulations for the panel. It was very, very interesting. And I have a question that I think is like a more an open question to all the panelists, because, well, we're talking about personalized medicine, about sex and gender bias in medicine. So we are mixing sex with gender, and it's not the same. So sex is something biological, and gender is something social and cultural. So my question is, first, why we are talking about both topics in the same atmosphere and the same environment, and second, how artificial intelligence can help to solve the problems in gender bias, because in sex it's more or less clear how the artificial intelligence can help, but in gender bias, how? That is my question.
Thank you. So if someone from the panel would like to ask to this question, why we are talking about sex and gender in the same place, and while maybe for sex this can be easier, let's say, to address, especially for artificial intelligence, while for gender there are a lot of, let's say, gray areas and not really well understood things. So I don't know if someone would like to say something about this.
So I guess that because of the nature of gender, which is, as I said, a multi-dimensional, complex social construct, really the biggest hurdle that we all face is to find a way to capture properly such complexity. Of course, when we try we are scientists, so we need a measure of something, right? And as Luis mentioned before, sometimes we want to simplify the complexity, but this is the only way that we have to do science right now. So the best that we can do is start to think that there are some gender-based determinants of health that we are not used to include, start to collect them, because as I said before, it's not really common that even in our clinical practice, we ask to our patient, which is your work, give me information about your family, do you have social support, or how do you feel, how do you perceive yourself, and which are the struggles that you are facing because of your identity. And then if we collect this information, I think that once we use also this factor in relation with biology, which is, it seems to be more simple to consider, to measure, we really can try at least to have a sense of more the complexity of the people that we have. Of course, it's more complex because there is not a standardized method, so you cannot test for gender, right? There is not a lab test for that. But the fact that this is complex should not avoid us to explore this landscape, because this is all about do better science and do something that it's generalizable for all people all across the world. And I think it's a duty for a clinical scientist to go through these difficulties in measuring gender or having more fair and equitable results.
Thank you. Carmen, yes.
I fully agree with Valeria, and at the same time, there are studies which have been conducted that have shed light precisely when introducing the gender. For example, in Karolinska in Sweden, Marianne Frankenhauser and Lundberg, in endocrine and psychology working hand in hand, have assessed the physical and mental stress entailed in different jobs, because it's not just life conditions but working conditions, and also we need to place the environment, what they eat, where they live, etc. So those working conditions, how they have an effect on the cardiovascular risk for men and women, because they showed some time ago that at work men is placed because of identity issues, because of competitiveness, are placed under stress with higher cortisol and adrenaline levels, and the women with the same working conditions, executives in Sweden, men and women working in the same job position, in the women, the adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol increased in the evening and at night, preparing the next day's conference, but doing the double working day. And the double working day, which is a social and gender-based aspect, introduced a cardiovascular problem, because on the next morning, when you are sleeping with high adrenaline levels, you're not going to sleep as well, etc. So it entails some pain, muscle pain, anxiety, and alterations, irritable colon syndrome related to the double working day, work at home, etc. So they opened my eyes, they shed light, because they could study conditioning factors which were gender-based that should be taken into consideration. And right now, some cardiologists, when conducting the Holter test, whereby they introduce an apparatus in order to monitor the frequency and the heart rate and the blood pressure through 24 hours, they saw that they needed to relate that to the conditions of the women. What were you doing, you woman, at that time when there was a peak in the heart rate or blood pressure? What were you doing? And if you draw a parallel line, and in fact they ask the patients that in addition to have the Holter apparatus, to keep a log of what they were doing all throughout those 24 hours. And this is a biomarker, an objective biomarker that entails a long-term cardiovascular risk. Why is there more hypertension in women? Which are the reasons for that? We need to think. I'm not saying that it's not just a biological, but we need to think about that. And as Valeria rightly mentioned, the science, it's our duty in science.
Use more data in order to design better technologies. So really this integration is definitely needed. So if there are no other questions from the audience, maybe one?
There's one last question.
One last question? Okay.
Yeah, it reads, los protocolos de actuación.
The protocols for clinical action are standardized. Is it easy to include the new knowledge that take into consideration sex differences that affect the diagnosis and the treatment of a certain pathology? Sorry, but I didn't hear you properly. Could you repeat the question? The clinical action protocols are standardized processes. Is it easy to include in those protocols the new knowledge that confirms sex-based differences that affect diagnosis and treatment of a certain pathology? Let me begin and then let's open it to the rest. let me tell you that it's not easy to include it, but it is necessary to include those factors. And when I'm asked that question in Spain, I tell them, look, in Spain we have an equality law in the year 2007 that amended the healthcare regulation, because we did it in our group and it is amended. And according to the law, we need to take into consideration the sex differences in all protocols and to take into consideration the social, psychological, gender conditions that can be a conditioning factor in the health. So by law, it is established in Spain, not in reality. It's not implemented. But when someone asks me, look, if someone tells you that this should not be included in the protocol, your service manager is not abiding by the law. According to the law, this is what should be done. But obviously, it's going to be difficult to change the protocols, but there are changes.
The other panelists would like to add something on those difficulties now when the protocols are so strict and there are some regulations that impede the easy inclusion of this kind of considerations. That's obviously, you know, something very difficult to. So yeah, I don't know if maybe Luis, if you can, in terms like more on the industry, no? When you develop and deploy a system, no, that has, for instance, an application in health, these kind of requirements are not really there. I mean, it's really up to the researcher if to consider, you know, the impact, especially under the lens of sex and gender.
Well, not so much, I mean, anymore. I think, for instance, to develop an application in any health domain, we are developing one for epilepsy patients in particular, for instance. You do really have to go through the IRB approval, so the ethics approval about everything you do. Our research is funded by NIH, which now plays a lot, I mean, any sort of human subject studies has to have you know, all sorts of regulations about considering sex as a variable. Not so much gender in the way we're talking about it, in the socially constructed way, which also has biomedical implications. But I mean, it is frustrating in some ways about the lack of the same criteria, right? So even when you try to publish your results, different journals have very different criteria. And sometimes we get papers rejected because we cannot retrospectively go change our ethics permission for what you do. And especially in my case, I use social media data too to try to understand the social implications of things, that it becomes very erratic. So I think it's growing pains. I think we will get to this. Eventually, we will settle to do this better. But right now, it is a little dangerous. I advise everybody to think very, very carefully when you do your ethics permission, your IRB, to try to think of all the problems that people can throw at you later on, as you all know. I mean, but it is a very difficult thing to do.
Thank you so much. Well, I think that I can close the session and by thanking all of you so much for your contribution to this event. I really enjoyed this experience, and I'm confident that all the things that we have discussed today will serve as a stepping stone, no, to overcome this issue of misrepresentation and discrimination of sex and gender categories in biomedicine, and above all, help building a more equitable society. So thank you again, and to the audience, see you to the next seminar of this cycle.
Thank you so much.